Hello everyone, herzlich willkommen zur neuesten Folge der Very British Actually Book Corner. Für alle von euch, die mich noch nicht kennen, mein Name ist Andrea, kurz auch Ria, und ich bin angehende Kultur- und Reisejournalistin mit Schwerpunkt Großbritannien. Auf meiner Facebook-Seite Very British Actually teile ich regelmäßig Wissenswertes und Schönes über British Culture, Travel, Films, TV-Shows, Books and more. Da ich seit einiger Zeit auch in London lebe, teile ich immer mal wieder Insider-Tipps, die ich hier als Local im Vereinigten Königreich so entdecke. Büchern räume ich hier in meiner Book Corner inzwischen einen ganz besonderen Platz ein. Und ich stelle euch hier im Gespräch tolle britische Autoren vor, die in Großbritannien schon enorm erfolgreich sind, in Deutschland größtenteils allerdings noch echte Geheimtipps sind. Meine heutigen Gäste in der Book Corner sind der Police Advisor Stuart Gibbon und Thriller-Autorin Philippa East. Und sie geben euch einen interessanten Einblick darin, wie es Krimi- und Thriller-Autoren gelingt, die Balance zwischen Fakten und Fiktion zu finden. In unserem Gespräch erzählen die beiden zunächst mehr über sich und ihre Schriftstellerkarriere, wobei Stuart vor allem darüber berichtet, wie er nach dem aktiven Polizeidienst zum Police Advisor für Krimi- und Thriller-Autoren wurde. Anschließend verraten die zwei ein bisschen mehr über ihre kreative Zusammenarbeit an Philippas Romanen und wie ihre Zusammenarbeit zustande gekommen ist. Sie geben auch interessante Beispiele darin, wie Szenen in den Psychological Suspense Büchern von Philippa zustande gekommen sind. Ihre bisherigen Romane A Little White Lies und Safe and Sound sind bislang zwar noch nicht in deutscher Sprache erhältlich, allerdings kann ich sie euch nur wärmstens ans Herz legen. Anschließend gibt Stuart auch noch einen Überblick in sein neuestes Sachbuch Catching A Killer, in der ausführlich beschrieben wird, wie Mordermittlungen im Vereinigten Königreich detailliert ablaufen. Und zum Schluss gibt Philippa East auch nochmal einen kleinen Einblick in ihren neuesten Roman I'll Never Tell, der im Vereinigten Königreich ab dem 5. Januar 2023 erhältlich sein wird. Und damit ein recht herzliches Willkommen in der Very British Actually Book Corner, Stuart Gibbon und Philippa East. So yeah, hello everyone and welcome to the Book Corner. And tonight I have the very pleasure to be talking to Stuart Gibbon, who is a police advisor for crime and thriller writers, and he's a former police officer, and also a thriller author, Philippa East, who has been working with Stuart on her books since she first started out. And before we get into how you first met and then how your collaboration works, it would be great if you could just briefly tell the audience a bit about yourself, about your background, and how you got to your writing. And Stuart, obviously, also what made you become a police advisor for crime and thriller writers. So yeah, over to you.
Stuart, do you want to go first?
Yeah, do you mind? I don't mind.
No, not at all. Not at all.
I'll go then. Yeah. Hello. Yeah, my name's Stuart Gibbon. As Ray quite rightly says, I was a police officer, and it's probably the only thing I can remember I wanted to do when I was a child. Growing up, I was from the northeast of England, which is a long way from where I am now, up almost towards Scotland, really. And I had this kind of ambition. It's a long story, but in a nutshell, we had a burglary at my parents' house, and it kind of frightened me a little bit. It was only little at the time. It's only a young child. I remember thinking this is really wrong. And literally the first time I can remember when I was old enough to sort of start making some decisions, I said, I want to be a police officer and try and prevent things like that happening. It sounds a bit corny, but it's exactly how it happened in my life. So I tried to join locally up in the northeast, but unfortunately they weren't recruiting at the time. So I remember sitting at the kitchen table, writing all these letters to all these different police forces. And I came down the country from the northeast. I got as far as the Midlands, and I made a really interesting decision. I also decided to write to the Metropolitan Police in London, which was a long, long way from home, not thinking for 1 minute that I would get a reply, let alone anything else. And you probably guessed it. The only positive reply I got was from Metropolitan Police inviting me down for some interviews and fitness training and that sort of thing. As a police cadet. So I was only 16 at the time. And I went down there and went through quite a rigorous training process. And then the letter came through the letterbox, and it was like, well, I don't think I did very well, but we'll see what happens. And then they invited me down to join. So I was on my way, still age 16, down to join the Metropolitan Police.
Oh.
And I stayed there for nearly 20 years. Initially, I was a police cadet, which means it's like an apprenticeship, really. You go out on patrol and you do things like that. And then I went to the training centre at Hendon in northwest London. And I did a pretty intensive 16-week training course, learning the law, and we did a lot of marching and that sort of thing, and a lot of sport. And eventually I took the final exam and managed to become a regular approved police constable. And I worked in London, pounding the beat for several years. And eventually I got in to become a detective, which again was lots of exams and those sort of things. In the year 2000, I transferred up to Lincolnshire, which is a bit like chalk and cheese, really, for those who know the UK at all. But if you think about London, one day I was getting on an underground tube to go to the Central Criminal Court, which is known as the Old Bailey, to give evidence in a criminal case. And the next day, when I moved to Lincolnshire, I was stuck in traffic behind a tractor. It was a very rural part of the UK, so you couldn't get two more polar opposites. But I actually loved it working there. It was very challenging for different reasons. And again, I worked as a detective most of the time until I left the police and retired from the service. So I'd done over 30 years then. I wasn't sure really what to do next, but a decision I made, which made me really become a kind of police advisor, was I was reading, I've always read crime books, either true crime or crime fiction. I was reading a crime fiction book one day after I left the police. And there was something in it that I recognised that I knew about quite a lot. And it was just a little bit, it was fine, but because I knew what I was talking about, I recognised something that wasn't quite right, really, in terms of the authenticity and the accuracy. So I just, out of curiosity, flicked to the back of the book to see in the acknowledgements whether there'd been anybody helping the writer with their kind of police procedure, and there wasn't anything. So that set me off on a train of thought, thinking I've got all this knowledge and experience in my head, which is exactly where it was at the time. I wonder if I could help writers with just a little bit of authenticity. So I began to sort of send loads of emails out to the crime writers that I could find on the internet. And it kind of just went from there. I didn't hear anything for ages, and I thought, well, that was a good idea. I thought, but maybe it just doesn't happen or whatever. And then suddenly I got a reply from a lady from the Crime Writers Association who said she thought it was a great idea, would I work with her? And then it kind of just snowballed from there, and that was several years ago. And it's just a case of enjoying working with the writer, however we do that work, and not to fill the book full of factual police procedure, because it's actually quite dull, a lot of it, really. But I just think if you've got those little golden nuggets within the book, and sometimes it's just about the author knowing the right way that it happens in reality, and then they can formulate the book. Because of course with books, the most important thing is that the writer, the author's happy with what they've written, that the plot's great, the characters are great, and the police procedure kind of sits way down the list of things. But actually with a little bit of good police procedure, I think it makes a big difference. And then just to finally top that off, I met a crime writer in Lincoln at a writing festival, 2015. His name's Stephen Wade, he's a crime historian, and we got talking, we became good friends, and we decided to start writing our own books based on factual cases that either I've been involved in or famous cases that the public may be aware of, with the aim of helping really writers, in particular crime writers, but also there is, I'm sure as you're aware, so much interest in the true crime genre across the world, with all the podcasts and the documentaries. So we decided to write books, and we've written 6 so far. And we've had some pretty good feedback, which is great, because it's then again things that the writer can have on the shelf, or that the fan can have on the shelf, and just keep dipping in and out of it and kind of picking it out. So that's where I'm from and what I've done, and that's where we are at the minute. And I do a little bit of television work, true crime documentary wise, but the main priority for me is obviously the police advisor role.
Brilliant. Yeah, and as you can see, Philippa is showing these brilliant books. She has them all.
I've got pretty much all of them, Stuart. So I don't know if you can see my screen at the same time, but I'm just wafting them past the camera to show them all. Such a great collection.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that, Philippa. So yeah, and then I think over to you, Philippa. Just tell us a bit about your background and how you got in touch with Stuart in the end to be working with him.
Yeah, so I think a little bit like Stuart, I had a sort of whole other career before getting involved in writing and books. So my day job is as a clinical psychologist and therapist, and I worked in the NHS for a number of years. Currently I work in private practice, so I have my own clinic here in Lincolnshire. And it was probably not until probably about 10-12 years ago now that I started to do a little bit of creative writing as an adult, having done little bits and pieces here and there at school, but probably no more than anybody else might have done, as a kid. And didn't really have a clue what I was doing, but just knew that I really enjoyed it. It felt like something that was the sort of a creative way of, because I tried lots of other creative things before, like, I don't know, photography or dance or pottery and things like that. And none of them kind of gelled for me. But when I was writing again, it really felt like this was a good fit for me. And I've always been a hugely voracious reader. Like that ever since I learned to read, that's just been such a huge part of what I do and who I am, really. So I started having fun with creative writing again as an adult, probably about 12 years ago. And while I was working full time in the NHS, I mainly wrote short stories, which I could kind of fit around the day job, and also was a really good way of learning the craft of writing, exploring some of the ideas that I wanted to delve into in my storytelling, and also starting to connect with other writing communities online and that sort of thing. And I moved to Lincolnshire in 2013. And at that point, I was still working in the NHS again full time. But then in 2015, that's when I left and went into private practice. And I was able to go part time at that point. And I sort of thought to myself, well, I've got more time. Maybe I should, think about a bigger writing project. And actually, I'd had this novel idea bouncing around in my head for quite a while. And, just kind of like when I asked myself that question, I was like, well, now's the time. Like, you kind of went part time, so you have more time to write. So maybe now it's time to write that novel. So yeah, and actually, I think probably not long after moving to Lincolnshire, so maybe around 2013, 2014, I joined a local writers group called the Lindham Scribes. And the way that I met Stuart was he came, this was probably fairly early on when you were starting out as well, Stuart, in terms of promoting yourself, in this line of work. But you came along, gave a talk to our writers group about the police procedures around and behind murder investigations. And it was a great talk. It was so, I think you used a real life case from Lincolnshire and kind of talked us through all the stages, and it was brilliant and so helpful and really inspiring. And then I think, when I was on my, however many it was, 26th round of edits or whatever, and I needed to pin down some of the kind of specifics in terms of the sort of police or investigation elements in my book, I got in touch with Stuart again. I can't remember where we met up on that first meeting, but we both live in Lincolnshire and not too far from each other. So actually, we must have met up probably in Sleaford or somewhere, I think, Stuart. I don't know if you could
probably
remember.
Probably the whole the first time, would that be?
Yeah, I think so. There's a sort of there's a National Art and Textiles Museum and Gallery in Sleaford. So I think we probably met in the cafe there. And yeah, then Stuart has helped me out with all my books since then, which has been invaluable, really.
It's so brilliant. What really struck me, because when I looked at your testimonials, Stuart, for your consultancy, was what you had written, Philippa, because I've printed it out because I thought it was just brilliant. And I hope it's okay if I read it out loud.
Of course. It's all true.
So Philippa said, I have consulted Stuart Gibbon for both of my domestic suspense books, which probably will be now 3 of them because the third one will be coming out. And each time he has been extremely knowledgeable, supportive and generous. He strikes a great balance between helping you create accurate and plausible scenarios and plots, while also respecting the story you are trying to tell. Oftentimes, my discussions with Stuart have sparked new ideas, characters, or twists, so it always feels like an exciting creative process. It's great to feel safe and confident putting my books out into the world, knowing that Stuart's expertise has been cast over them. And I just thought that's such a brilliant testimonial. So what I was wondering about is if you could tell us a bit more how you actually do this, kind of working through finding the balance between facts and fiction. I mean, Stuart, you already mentioned that for you, it's more giving the novel this extra bit of realistic storytelling, but also that you very much want the writer to tell a story that doesn't necessarily have to happen in reality. So yeah, I would be very curious to just see how you do that, if you come to Stuart at a very early stage of your draft, or if you give him the full manuscript, or just talk us a bit through how you actually approach each other and how you communicate.
So I mean, it may be different with different authors, and obviously Stuart, you could speak more to this, but I probably consult Stuart pretty late in the day, which for me, that's probably a good thing. I don't know. I think for me, I like to get the story out that I'm telling without getting too hung up on facts and reality, because I think that would just really stifle me just getting the story down and trying to work out the whole arc of the story. So that potentially means I may have boxed myself into a corner if I've written something that would just never happen in a million years. But yeah, so normally I would have a full draft down. I might have gone through a few rounds of edits first, so that I'm pretty sure that this is the version of the story that is sitting right for me. And then I think it's probably been slightly different for different books, but I think probably I've normally just sent Stuart the sections that involve the police procedure stuff. I mean, just because I think, your time is precious, Stuart, and I don't, having you read the entire manuscript, when you don't necessarily have to, although obviously you're always welcome to, but I normally kind of pull out the police procedure bits and send that to Stuart for a general read through to pick up any kind of glaring errors that I've made. But I might also have some specific questions that I might put in an email saying, is this possible? Is that possible? Does that make sense? And then I think generally what we've done is you've then obviously read that in your own time, Stuart, and kind of made notes and stuff. And then normally we've met up, haven't we? Again, because we live locally to each other. We would kind of normally meet up over a coffee somewhere and just go through it. And I would always be really nervous going into those meetings. So I would always be really frightened that Stuart was going to say, this whole critical plot point that you've got here, that could never, that would just never happen. but it's never been like that. And I think, again, like we were kind of saying just now, and like you were saying as well, Stuart, I think one of the things that's really good in the way that you work is that you will always help the author find a way to make the story that they need actually work. So I remember in my first one, which is Little White Lies, which is this one, I think I've got a bit where my police detective breaks or would do something that I had a sort of sense would be a breach of protocol. And I said to Stuart, well, could my police detective do this? And Stuart was really good. He was like, well, no, technically that would be a breach of protocol, but why don't you think about why he's breaching protocol and hang a flag on it in your book that it is a breach of protocol? And then I was like, oh yeah, my detective could have this motivation. And then it kind of sparked all these other ideas. Whereas Stuart could have just said, no, that's not protocol, that he couldn't do that. And then, do you know what I mean? Then you kind of hit a brick wall. But Yeah, so it feels really like there's always a possibility, which is so relieving.
Brilliant. And maybe we could dive a bit more into your novels themselves, because as I've already said, you're a thriller writer, and you're mainly about psychological suspense, which I've read Safe and Sound, and I really, really loved it. It was just an amazing story. And I could really see that your expertise as a psychologist really went into this story already. But Safe and Sound, for example, as I've seen on several interviews that you've given, is based on a real case. And maybe you can tell us a bit about the story, and then also how you worked with that on Stuart, because I think it's an interesting thing to just know.
Yeah. So as you say, Safe and Sound is actually based on a real case that I had seen a film about, actually, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. And then, funnily enough, kind of since I wrote and published the book, other similar cases have come out in the news, and it's a sort of perennial storyline that comes up, actually, sadly. But basically, Safe and Sound is told from the point of view of a woman called Jen, who is a housing manager. And she has a bit of stuff going on in her own life, so she's not been quite as on the ball with her tenants and her properties as she should have been. Anyway, there's a tenant called Sarah Jones who has never been a problematic tenant until recently. Kind of those who know her describe her as someone who's charismatic and pretty and sociable, friendly, amicable, goes to work. She's a young woman, she's only in her 20s, but she's recently fallen behind with her rent, and it's got to the point where Jen needs to go with a couple of bailiffs and knock on the door, having sent a number of letters out and so on. And when they reach the flat, they can hear the radio playing inside, so they're pretty sure Sarah Jones is in there, but she's not answering the door. After kind of a little while of knocking and trying to get her to answer, they have a suspicion that actually something is not quite right inside this flat. So they ultimately make the decision for Jen to use her master key to enter the bedsit. And when they get in there, they, as well as the radio playing, they also find this dinner table that's been set for 2 guests. So Sarah was clearly expecting some people to come round. But what they also discover is Sarah's body curled up on the sofa, and it quickly becomes apparent that Sarah has been laying there for nearly 10 months with nobody realizing that she had died. And so the story is really Jen's efforts to try and piece together how on earth this could have happened, and how it could have happened on her watch as well, and what on earth was going on in Sarah Jones's real life that would lead her to end up in these kind of circumstances. So it's quite light on the police procedural stuff in this one, although there was some stuff at the start, because obviously, the police are involved at the beginning. So again, I think a lot of it was just sort of checking some of the finer details with Stuart. This was probably less policey than Little White Lies. But again, just having that kind of safety net of just making sure you weren't putting any total clangers in that would make you look like an idiot, really, and kind of pull readers out of the story and that sort of thing.
Did you also talk about when would be the time of the inquest? Because that is part of the story as well. And I was wondering if you've talked about that as well. You did, okay.
Yeah, we did actually, and that was the thing, because I think I'd said to Stuart initially, like, oh, how long is it normally before there's an inquest? And I think, Stuart, you're like, well, this can be sort of months and months and months and months down the line. And I was like, well, that's not going to work for my book. And then Stuart was like, well, maybe they could have had a cancellation and they've just slotted her in early. And I was like, yes, that'll do. I'll put that in. So again, it was one of those nice examples of, well, this is what would normally happen, but you could show that there's a slight, a slightly unusual situation, and it goes through more quickly, and then you don't have to have a weird story where all your characters are just sitting around twiddling their thumbs for 9 months waiting for the next bit of action. So yeah,
that is brilliant. I like the fact that you actually, Stuart, think of a way how you can actually fit this into the timeline, even if it is not really an ordinary thing that would happen. You usually have more time.
Kind of a glass half full person rather than half empty, if you like. So there is always a way. There's always a way. So even if you think, you can do it. You might just have to do a little bit of tweaking, but it'll work. And as Philippa says, late in the day is quite good actually, because you've got all your ideas down. The worst thing then is for me to say to you, you're gonna have to start again, which I would never do. But it's just then I can look at it and I can say, well, and all I give is feedback, and that's all it is. And some writers will take that and go with it, and others will say, well, actually, no, I want to write it, and that's absolutely fine. But if you know the little, as I say, I always call them nuggets of things to put in there, even if they're just figure of speech, the way the police officers or detectives talk, some of the terminology or the references, I personally think it makes such a difference to the book, and the feedback from readers seems to be that is the case as well. So it was, with Safe and Sound, it's a brilliant novel. It's brilliant. It's very sad, of course, and it's so powerful. I think the conversations that Philippa and I had were more along the lines of maybe a little bit about the police attending the scene, but it was more around the coronial side of things. So the coroner officer, the inquest, and on those sort of things, because, like you say, these are things that do happen in reality, sadly. And if you've got that information, you can just, if you want to put it in the book, then it just helps it to move along really with the story.
Oh, brilliant. I was wondering about that because, as you just said, the policey stuff is very much on the side and Safe and Sound, whereas Little White Lies, that it is much more prominent, isn't it? And I reckon, even though I haven't read your new book yet, because it's not out yet, it kind of goes in the same direction, because A Little White Lies is about a girl that went missing years ago, and then she's suddenly back, and her mum needs to come to terms with this teenager that she basically has now instead of a child, but also kind of work out how much she remembers about her disappearance. And then also in your new book, there is a family where a child disappears at that moment when you write the story. So I think in a way that there probably will be more policing than again in the third book.
Yeah. And actually, I think there's a scene near the end of my third book, which is I'll Never Tell, that I don't think I showed you, Stuart. I think I just winged it. And now I'm panicking about it. Or maybe I did show you. I can't remember. But yeah, it's okay.
I'll let you know.
I think I was on my massive rewrite at that point. I was like, I cannot take any more feedback that says this isn't okay. But I'm sure it's fine. And I've put a bit in the acknowledgements to say that, you are not held responsible for my errors. So
I always love that when I read that in your acknowledgement, that you're like, okay, Stuart has been brilliant. If there's anything wrong, it's all me.
Yeah. But again, you did help me with that one, didn't you? Because obviously the police come to the house and they, sort of interview the parents just as a way of, in order for them to put a missing persons, kind of file together. And it's one of the other things that's so nice with Stuart is like, I can't think of a specific example, but there's definitely been times when I've put something absolutely ridiculous in that just doesn't, like, when you read it back, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And Stuart's always like, now, I don't think the police would do it quite like this. It would. He's always so nice about it, and you're just like, yeah, they probably wouldn't lick the bloodstain off the wall for testing, would they? Like I've written it, or something like that. Something totally stupid that you're like, oh God, of course not. So you're never made to feel stupid, which is always good.
That's good. But I would also reckon that since you've been working together on your books for a while, that you also get a bit more confidence with the knowledge you already have and with the books that you have from Stuart. So you can kind of probably have a sneak in there if you're like, oh, let me have a look at that, and then maybe just double check with Stuart at one point.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think there's stuff that you've taught me along the way, Stuart, that, I feel like I know now, like about the difference between like a DC and a DCI, for example, or where a DS fits in and all of that kind of thing. And like, yeah, you wouldn't have like a DCI doing door-to-door, not like inquiries or something like that. And I'm like, I think I got that. And yeah, like kind of, yeah, but it's so true, isn't it? It's those little bits of kind of authenticity. Like I remember, I think I had a scene, I think it would have been in Little White Lies, where I think it's Anne, the mum, has to sign a witness statement or something, and you gave me like the exact wording that would be, kind of as the headers and footers of that form. And it was, yeah, it's nice to just include those kind of touches of reality. I think those tiny little details that just bring things to life, then I could never really figure that out myself. How would I ever find such specific information? It would be really hard to track down.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I think with that one in particular as well, I think you can then go into the head of the person who's making the statement, because it's a really formal declaration that says, this is the truth. But if I put something in here that isn't the truth, I'm liable to prosecution, and that sort of, so it kind of, then you can have the character thinking, crikey, I'm signing this and I'm almost signing my life away, really. It's got to be right.
Yeah.
Otherwise I'm in trouble. So that it works like that as well, I think.
Yeah, it was a good way to kind of show the stakes, wasn't it? Of kind of like, the stakes for her for taking this risk of, putting down what she's pretty sure is true, but yeah, she's risking prosecution if she's actually kind of realizes she's fudged it later on or whatever. Yeah, it was good. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's definitely good to know. I would just be interested, Stuart, when you work with people who are more doing police procedural, do you get involved more earlier than, or do you think it would be more helpful for you or the writers to be involved more earlier on to help them shape the characters, or to see how they act and how people work together?
I think it really varies, to be honest. I'm quite flexible. I don't mind if the writers come late on and say, this is what I've done, can you give me some feedback? But there are other writers that I work with who come very, very early in the process, and even just give me the ideas first. Nothing to look at in terms of a chapter or two or a section of questions, just this is in my head, what do you think, kind of thing. In fact, I've got one at the moment, which is about Munchausen by proxy, and all the background in relation to that. It's in very early stages. That's an author I'm working with who has come to me really early on and said, look, I'm thinking of writing about this. This is what I'm thinking of doing. What do you think? And just a very early feel for it, to say, well, number one, do I know much about that sort of thing and how the police would deal with issues around those sort of subjects. So it varies for me. I really don't mind. And as I say, a lot of the time it's not necessarily that the person is going to put the information into the book. It's just they want to know. They want to know, so then they can go away and say, right, I know how it works now. This is how I'm going to write it. And if I want to dip in and out of how it works in reality, then that's great. I'm quite flexible, to be honest with you. I don't mind. I think I'd rather, if you put me on the spot, be some way along the line with the information, because the more I've got, the better. So if I can look at some chapters or maybe a plot outline or something that helps me a little bit more. Not everything, but just enough. This is what I'm thinking. That helps a little bit, rather than just. But I have had lengthy conversations with writers, both on the phone and on via email, where we've battered things backwards and forwards for ages about, will this work? No, maybe not. What about that? And then what about that? And eventually we will get somewhere along the line, and it always works, because like I say, there's always a way around these things. And if with the one that Philippa mentioned, you've always got flexibility, and you've always got the alternative that, well, a police officer wouldn't do that. Well, actually, they might do. They might do it for a really good reason. They might do it because they're going rogue, because they're not not going to do it. They're going to go against the rules and they're going to get in trouble. So you've always got the flexibility. You don't necessarily have to follow it straight down the line. As long as there's just a little sprinkling in there, I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you know that the stakes are increased or that someone is breaking the rules, I think that's also then good to know what will be the consequences, to just, to just play with that and then maybe see if there is something that could add to the novel in a way, to add more drama, or, just to make it a bit more of a problem for the character to deal with.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I agree totally. Yeah,
I think that is a very, very great thing to do, and I think it's so fascinating to hear how you actually work together. And I think it would be great, even though I'm not sure how many people of my German audience would consider writing a book in English. Would need to know the information, but maybe there are people who are just interested in history and culture and all this stuff, about the police service in the UK. So Stuart, I thought that you would tell us a bit more about the latest book that you have co-written with Stephen Wade, I think. The latest book you have published together was Catching a Killer. And it would be great to just give an overview what people would find. Yeah. A brilliant cover.
It's great, isn't it? Yeah,
I need it now as well.
this is full on promotion.
Yeah, buy it now in all good bookshops.
To just tell us a bit what kind of content people would find in there.
Yeah, certainly. Well, the reason we wrote the book, because we've written several before then about lots and lots of different subjects, was because murder is the most popular for true crime genre fans, and it's also crops up quite a lot in crime fiction, of course. There's often a murder, not always, of course, but often there is. So we decided that we'd concentrate on the subject of murder, and whenever we write our books together, Stephen will write the historical, so he's brilliant with things that happened in the 1700s and the 1800s and the 1900s, etc. And then I tend to pick it up probably in the mid-1980s up till present day. And we've split this book into three. So from my point of view, contemporary, it really deals with everything to do with a police murder investigation in the UK. So from the first telephone call from a witness or somebody that sees something happening, all the way through to how the police would respond, who would deal with what, all the forensic side, the team that would be involved, how that works in the UK, all the way through the process of trying to identify the person who's committed the murder, because it's not always obvious. Talks about motives, about the victim, which is of course very important, supporting the families, all the way through to potentially arresting someone and what happens to that person when they're brought to the police station, exactly what goes on, how long the police can detain them for, and then what happens if and when the case goes to court. And we've also certainly from the contemporary, I've split it into two other sections. I thought it'd be really interesting for readers to know about some of the people that help the police during a murder investigation, and by that I mean the experts. So I've included a list of experts, everybody from the forensic pathologist who will carry out the post-mortem examination, all the way through to people like a forensic podiatrist who deals with the way that people walk. And I've used a forensic podiatrist in a murder case of mine, where we had some very grainy closed-circuit television footage of the murder suspects running away from the scene of the crime. It was very poor quality, it was black and white, it was dark. You could never identify these three people, but a forensic podiatrist was able to look at that footage and tell me that one of the three people was running in a particular way, which indicated that they had a limp or there was a problem with their leg. And when we identified the three individuals, one of them had been involved in a serious road traffic collision and had actually had a big operation on his leg, which was actually one of his legs was shorter than the other. So he did run in a particularly distinctive way. And that's fascinating for me because that just takes it to a completely new level. So we've got the experts in there, and I've also put quite a lot in about forensic evidence because it fascinates people. DNA, how the police use DNA, how the scientists recover it, what it means. And one of the things we do with our books, we try to make them even more interesting for readers, is we put lots of case studies in, real case studies, some of my cases from my police career and others that people, as I said earlier, would probably be aware of. Just trying to bring it to context, because there's some, I wouldn't say it's dry, but there's some real factual stuff in there. So to back it up with, this is what this happens here. Oh, by the way, this is when it happened, and this is the result of it. I think that just helps a little bit. As I say, Stephen has written the historical. So it's a walkthrough of a murder investigation from the very first moment that the crime takes place until hopefully the killers are identified and brought to justice.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that sounds very, very fascinating. That's definitely going to go on my in my basket. And yeah, I think people should definitely, who are interested in policing, or just, people who love crime dramas and just like to see how it's really done, I think will be fascinated by your books as well. And I think this one in particular, this kind of detail of murder investigation.
It gives you the other side, because as you say, the true crime dramas, they're normally an hour or 2 hours, and everything's got to be rammed into those 2 hours or whatever. And you will find the DCI, which is something I used to do, Detective Chief Inspector, normally in charge of the murder case. You'll find them running around chasing people and arresting them and interviewing them and doing all that hands-on work that in reality never happens. I'd be the one probably I do go out, of course, I do fairly important things as a DCI, but I don't arrest people, I don't interview them. That's designated to specialist officers, and I just oversee the process and make the key decisions and make sure that I've written it all down, so that if I have to stand in the box at court in a year's time and someone says to me, Mr. Gibbon, why did you do that, or why did you not do that, I've got all my notes to refer to and say, well, actually, this is why I made that decision, and this is why I didn't do this. And that just kind of gives you the balance between, when you see it on TV, it's not quite the same. It can't be, because it wouldn't be as exciting. Behind my computer, typing furiously away, it doesn't work really.
Yeah, I've seen. I think with true crime dramas, that really is the most challenging thing, because when it's fictional, like Midsummer Murders, which is Inspector Barnaby in Germany. It's absolutely inaccurate, but it's so ridiculous, these kind of way people are murdered, that it's so entertaining that people just love it for the absolute ridiculous way people are murdered in English villages, apparently.
There's one person that was squashed with a large piece of cheese, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. They were.
Classic British.
Happens quite regularly.
Yeah.
Definitely classic Midsummer murder. I think, with true crime drama, it gets more challenging, because you're talking about a real case, but you still want to dramatize it in a way. So I think that is probably really the way to, kind of find that balance as well.
I think the thing to bear in mind is what I do when I do the documentaries is there's always a family behind these tragic stories. There's always a victim, and there's always a victim's family, and that's got to be at the forefront of my mind and other people's mind, because yes, the genre is so popular, but every case is tragic, no matter what circumstances. So as long as you've always got that in your mind, at the forefront of your mind, and you do things for the right reasons, and you portray the people in the right way, because the victims are the most important people in the process.
Yeah, agreed. Kind of honor that, and also, as you just said, the tragedy behind it, to actually make that also for people to feel that this is not just for pure entertainment, but there's a real impact behind that people's lives have been changed by forever. So, and I think that is also very, very important to treat that sensitively. Yeah, and coming back to you, Philippa, at the end again, and maybe you can tell us a bit more about your book. I mean, we've already scratched a bit on I'll Never Tell, which will be out in the UK in January 2023, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was thinking it's only 4 months or something now, because we are quite a long way through the year.
We are, yeah. Yeah, that you just tell us a bit about the book, what people, maybe you even have a proof to show people, because I love the cover. It's just amazing.
Oh, it's good, isn't it? It's good, isn't it? So so this is the proof. So this is pretty much what the cover will look like, and obviously at the moment it's got more of a tagline on the front, but it's the actual title is I'll Never Tell. So I'll Never Tell is my third psychological suspense book. It's about the Goodlight family who live in Oxford, and they are mum Julia, who is a high-flying lawyer, and then Paul, who is her husband and a stay-at-home dad, really supporting their teenage daughter Chrissy, who is a rising star as a violinist. And from the outside, the Goodlights, they look like a perfect family, really. They couldn't fault them. Anyway, Chrissy is taking part in the National Young Musician of the Year music competition, which obviously is a very prestigious event. And she's actually tipped to win the whole thing. And she goes with her family to the televised semi-finals in London and gives an absolutely jaw-dropping performance. And then, right there on the same night, in public view, she completely vanishes. And her disappearance basically throws a huge spotlight on the Goodlight family and starts to reveal all the things that are really going on behind the rather perfect facade. Yes, out in January, available to pre-order now in all good bookshops and online.
Yeah, and I think that sounds very, very interesting again, and I'm definitely going to put that in my basket as well.
Thank you, Ria.
Yeah, and I can highly recommend Philippa's books to my German audience. Sadly, they aren't available in German yet. Maybe we can do something about that.
Yeah, if you can camp outside the main German publishers, just shrieking about how you want to get me a German publishing deal. But yes, there's a Little White Lies and Safe and Sound.
So it was really, really lovely to talk to you both about this very interesting topic and insight about how crime and thriller writers are actually working with the police together. So thank you everyone for watching. Until the next time.
Thank you, Rhea.
Bye.